being able to be a great text critic. It's not something that someone could just do in a year or two. It's something that one must actually dedicate a considerable chunk of their life. But I'm wondering why you decided to do so, because when I was looking at some of the videos about your story, you left Christianity because of this reason, from what I understand.
So I got interested in that because I believed that the original words were inspired by God. And so I wanted to know what the words were, since we have all these manuscripts that have differences in them. So that's what got me going. What kept me going was somewhat different. I actually did leave the faith about 25 years ago. I stopped being a Christian. And it wasn't actually because of the scholarship. The reason I left the faith was not because I knew the Bible had mistakes, or I knew that for a long time, and I stayed a Christian for a long time, knowing that. What made me leave the faith was I got to a point where I just couldn't believe that there was a God who was in the world, who was active, a loving, powerful God who's active in the world, given all of the massive suffering that people experience. I just thought, I just don't believe it anymore. But then why do I continue being a New Testament scholar? I'm passionate about the New Testament. I'm passionate about the study of early Christianity. And largely it's because it is such an important historical phenomenon. And Christianity took over the entire Roman Empire and became the religion of the Western world. Basically, the dominant religion of the Western world. And there's still more Christians in the world than anything else. It's like, whoa.
The Islamic idea is that there cannot be someone, it's not intelligible or conceivable or pardonable for someone with a date of birth to be referred to as God anyway. So Jesus Christ will be disqualified from that perspective. But this is why there's a lot of interest, I think, from the Muslim community on your kind of work, because it's historical work that's being done. And many Muslims feel that kind of your vision of, or your conclusions, your historical conclusions of who Jesus Christ is more commensurate with at least the Muslim idea than it is with the Christian one. To what extent would you agree or disagree with that notion?
I would say that my views don't fit in well with traditional Christianity in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say that they line up well with the Muslim view. For example, I really do think Jesus was crucified and that he really was dead and buried. So there are differences. And there are a lot of people identify as Christian who do not think that it's important to think that Jesus was physically raised from the dead or that he is literally God. There are people who identify as Christian with those views. And so, for me, I don't get involved with the theological controversies because I'm not theological. I don't believe in God at all. And so I'm not interested in whether Jesus was the Son of God, because I don't think there's a God. But I am interested in the historical question. And, how was Jesus understood during his lifetime? This is this topic of this webinar that I'm doing on Sunday. Did Jesus think he himself was God? Did he think he was God? Right. And I treat this as a historical question. Of course, on a theological grounds, Christians would say, yeah, well, of course he did. But my question is, how do you establish that if you're doing it from a historical perspective? Like without faith, it's not that you're Christian or anti-Christian or some other religion. It's just like, just historically, how would you go about showing if Jesus thought he was God? And I think actually historians can say something about this that will be surprising to a lot of people.
So what is, from once again reading a book, misquoting Jesus and other things, my understanding is that your conclusion is that Jesus Christ was a messianic prophet, right? That at least that what he claimed he was, not a god or necessarily the Son of God, but not a god. To what extent is that a true representation of your beliefs?
I think it's interesting in the New Testament that Jesus does claim to be God in the Gospel of John. Yeah. Which is our final gospel. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the historical Jesus considered himself to be a divine being at all. I think he thought that he was a son of God in the sense that he was specially chosen by God, and that I think Jesus really did think he was going to be the Messiah, the future deliverer, the future King of Israel. That is, after all, why they crucified him for saying that he was the king of Israel. And so I think that that's historically right. But that the Messiah was not supposed to be a divine figure. The Messiah was a human, and prophets were humans. And Jesus certainly understood himself as a prophet and as a teacher and probably as the Messiah. and a son of God in the sense that other people were sons of God. I mean, the king of Israel was the son of God. He's called the son of God. And priests were sometimes, or prophets, they could be called the son. And so I don't think that Jesus thought that like he existed before he was born, or that he was born of a virgin. I don't think that any of that's probably right. John has a whole different set of stories. And I think that all of these gospel authors, I think all of them think that in some sense, Jesus is God. But it's only in the Gospel of John that Jesus goes around saying things like, I and the Father are one, or before Abraham was, I am, or if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are quite amazing statements.
What it is usually, the way we kind of put this forward is that there's the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. So the way we would put it is that it's a necessary condition for a book from God not to have contradictions. It's not sufficient for it to be without contradictions.
I know a lot of Christians who disagree with that, because that's an assumption about what kind of book God could write. And for example, I know theologians who would say, Christian theologians who would say that yes, Matthew and Mark contradict at this point, but it's because Matthew's trying to make this important theological statement and Mark's trying to make that important theological statement. And both theological statements are true, even if they're not both historical.
Yes. No, but then the question is, if it's both, I mean, we're talking more about people that take the high view of Scripture and biblical inerrancy, rather than kind of Christian scholars that come afterwards and talk about like, for example, those who say, I'm not talking about. There are many.
If you hold to inerrancy, then the contradiction thing's a big problem. Well, I know this is an important argument that apologists use for Islam. My view about this is, as somebody who is not either Christian or Muslim, is that that it doesn't make sense to me for humans to say what God has to do. If God wants to make a revelation, it has to be this, or that. It's got to be clear. It's got to be consistent. There cannot be contradictions. There cannot be manuscript problems. I mean, who says? I mean, God. I mean, you're talking about somebody who's beyond your imagination.
Well, so what we would reply to that, right, is that we would say, otherwise it would be indistinguishable from human speech. There has to be something within Revelation which distinguishes it from human speech, so as to act as an evidence.
Yes, I know that's your argument, but I'm saying, who says it has to be? You are.
No, if it's not, then the issue would be then that anyone can claim prophecy or prophethood, right? Anyone can claim prophethood.
Well, the Christians say that's what the Christians say Muslims are doing. They're just claiming things for themselves.
This is what we would say. We would say that in the past, prophets came. This is actually what Ibn Hajar said, the same scholar that I've mentioned before, the Hadith scholar. He said that in the past, prophets came with kind of visual miracles. So things like splitting the sea, we believe in that, right? So Moses came and he turned the stick into a snake and all this kind of. So they did that. And he said the difference between those prophets and those who came after, or the final prophet, who's we believe Prophet Muhammad, that he came with something that can be analyzable in our times. So if it didn't have that analyzable quality, then once again, in terms of evidentiary basis, it would be lacking. So let me put it in this way. So for example, if I was there at the time of Moses and I saw him split the sea, and then I go and tell my grandchild about that, my grandchild has a lesser kind of accessibility to that miraculous nature of splitting the sea than I do. And so therefore the evidence that prophets are meant to provide to evidence their prophethood would be disparate from me to another person. But if it's analyzable in a sense that you can distinguish it from human speech, and you can do so in all times and places, then from that perspective, it becomes something which anyone in any generation can look at and distinguish from human speech. So for us, just to kind of finish this point, there's two things. There's what we call necessary conditions, things like that there should be, because usually, like you've mentioned, not just Greek logic, but any kind of logical L1, propositional logic, that a contradiction is false. It's a false statement. And so the fact that it doesn't fulfill the logical criterion for truth, if something which does not fulfill the logical criterion for truth presents itself as God's words, or the words of the all-knowing one, that should have, and then God decides to punish somebody because they're not following it, it's less voracious than someone saying, well, actually, God is punishing someone for not believing in something, which there are evidences of, both necessary evidences, as we mentioned, preservation and inconsistent, but then also the sufficient evidences. So prophecies, we believe in prophecies of the Quran, prophecies of the hadith, things that will happen in the future, the Prophet told us about, and so on, which you can read a book called The Forbidden Prophecies. I can't go into it now because this will descope the discussion. But things like that, which will act as sufficient conditions now to satisfy the probabilistic reasoning of a human being. Somebody in the 7th century can kind of look at that, and someone in the 20th century can look at that, and so this would be the argument that we would put forward.
Yeah, no, I know, and I don't buy it. I think that it's based on assumptions about what's necessary. And you might say that logic is logic, but logic is not logic. I mean, anthropologists have clearly shown that, in fact, in different cultures, what counts as logic in one culture does not count as logic in another. So somebody else could come along and say the necessary condition for truth is that it's revealed as soon as human beings appear on earth, because it is necessary that God always had the same truth. And if he doesn't always have the same truth, so it has to go back to Adam and Eve, or it's not true, because it's necessary for God to reveal it to everybody who's ever lived. So people could say all sorts of things about what's necessary, but they're just saying what their tradition has taught them, or what they, what makes sense to them, or what is logical in their point of view. I share your logic, but the law of non-contradiction is not written into the nature of reality. It's written into our particular Western philosophical tradition.
Put it in this very blunt way, who was Jesus Christ? Who, according to you, was Jesus Christ?
So I think Jesus was a completely human being. I think that he was he's from a little town called Nazareth. There's a small little hamlet. He was impoverished. He was probably a day laborer of some kind, and he was some kind of religious genius, I think, maybe with a charismatic personality, who I don't think he was well educated, probably wasn't educated at all, but he had a gift for insight into matters of religion, and understood that he himself had been chosen by God in order to proclaim that God was soon going to intervene in history to destroy all the forces of evil that are creating all the misery and suffering in the world. And God was going to bring in the paradise that the world was supposed to originally have. There was going to be a kingdom here on earth, and people would be raised from the dead in order either to be brought into the kingdom or to be destroyed for all time. And he thought this was going to happen very soon. He offended the authorities for a variety of reasons connected with his message, and they decided that he was a troublemaker, and they arranged for him to be crucified, and they executed him with Islam. And for a Christian audience, it's really important, because if Jesus didn't call himself God, suppose he did not call himself God, that would not mean he's not God, right? I don't call myself a pain in the neck.
What would be your strongest evidences to someone who's a skeptic of the existence of Jesus in the first place?
Well, I wrote a whole book on this called "Did Jesus Exist?" because the evidence is so overwhelming. This is not a debated point among experts, whether they're atheists or agnostics or Christians or Jews. It's just like, it's not. But there is this a loud group of mythicists who think Jesus didn't exist, and you just wonder, how much evidence do you need? I mean, so in my book, I go through, we have all of these sources of information. I mean, you have these 4 gospels, but these 4 gospels are based on earlier sources that were all independent of each other. And you've got an author like Paul, who personally knew Jesus' brother, and he personally knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. And it's like, he's not trying to prove Jesus existed. He's just like, Paul, it's like, if Jesus' brother didn't exist, you'd think he'd know it. If Jesus had a brother, you'd think his brother would know that he didn't exist. Yeah. So, anyway, so I think that they, I just think that it's not a helpful point of view, and that if you're opposed to Christianity, there are probably more helpful ways to go about it than to say that Jesus didn't exist. If I ever did, which I never would. I mean, I don't believe in attacking any other religions or discounting. But if I wanted to discount Judaism, or if I wanted to discount Islam, I wouldn't say, well, Muhammad never lived. Well, of course he lived. It doesn't mean I have to agree with him.